This is Media Sales Mastery, the podcast for media sales professionals. In each episode, we bring you information, insights, ideas, and interviews from some of the industry's top thought leaders. Head to mediasalesmastery.com to help pick the topic and guide the show.
This is Media Sales Mastery, the podcast for media sales professionals. I'm your host, Jamie Wood. Our topic this fortnight, understanding how clients buy. And look, it is a bit of a different approach to usual. What we typically cover are tactics, are strategies, we unpack processes. We talk about very specific topics that help us excel in the profession of media sales. This episode's a bit different. We're actually going to delve into human behavior and psychology and really try to get to the core of what it is that truly influences a buying decision in a media transaction. Our guest today, David Roddick, partner of a consultancy firm called Kinzler. Now, these guys are really interesting. I'd encourage you to jump onto their website, which is in the show notes. They are a neuroeconomic consultancy, right? And it's going to probably be better articulated by Dave, what it is that they do in their area of specialization. But suffice to say, it's a very interesting area for anyone who works in media sales to really kind of get into. Prior to this, Dave has spent many years. He's worked in the role of Chief Sales Officer. He's worked as National Sales and Marketing Director for some of Australia and the UK's largest media publishers. So he's led big sales teams. He's run big sales orgs. Now he's working in the consulting space in this very specific area. I'm really jazzed to get him on. Before I jump into the episode, one final apology and acknowledgement from me. The golden rule of podcasting is you've got to keep your upload schedule consistent, and I promised one episode per fortnight for the rest of the year. I got knocked out with a pretty nasty sinus infection, and I had a few cancellations on account of COVID with some recording, which has thrown me back a bit. So I can't make any guarantees that I'm going to have that regular fortnightly episode just because I'm chasing my tail a bit. But if you are listening to this, thank you for sticking by. I really do hope that you were disappointed to find that you didn't get a podcast. Without any more rambling from me, let's jump into the episode now.
The first five.
Dave, welcome to the show.
Lovely to be here.
Before we sort of get into this topic of understanding how clients buy, maybe give us a bit of a synopsis on your career to date. And in particular, I'm really interested to know what led you to found Kinzler, which is such a unique kind of consulting business model, one that I haven't really heard of before.
I'm afraid I'm long in the tooth media sales exec. Started selling print media way back in the day in the UK, when papers actually were the dominant form of media at that time. And I've nearly collected the full set in my journey through media sales. I've done print, digital, outdoor, television. I haven't done radio, so I've never done any audio. So you've got one up on me there, Jamie. But I have done most of the other forms and worked and I've been lucky enough to move around the world and worked in over 30 countries with media owners and looking at how media gets sold. Amazing amounts of similarity, frankly, between culture. China and Brazil and Norway and Switzerland, and they all have very similar challenges in terms of how media goes to market. So that's been a fascinating journey. It's ended up with me in Australia. And through that journey and through the evolution of media, one of the things that fascinated me was when programmatic started to gather momentum. So probably 10 or 12 years ago now, I started to talk to the teams that I was working with and the teams that I led about how they could make a difference that was uniquely human, and where machines were never going to automate the process. And that's led me over the course of that last 10 or 12 years to look increasingly at how human beings actually interact with each other in an economic context. So when you're making business decisions, or when you're transacting with one another, or you're doing planning, or you're communicating in a business context, what's actually happening biologically between humans that makes the thing happen? How does it all work? And that's led me to now with what I do with the business, with the Kinzler business, which is look at how neuroscience affects economics and business settings.
It is a really interesting juxtaposition because you're absolutely right. There's so much technology innovation, there's so much automation, there's so much of what we do in this space really, I'm not going to say being outsourced to machines, but we're very much looking at tech and trying to identify how that can give us an edge and to really kind of look at the complete other end of the spectrum of how do we actually look at human interaction and context and certainly things like neuroscience and whatnot. It is a fascinating area because the topic we're covering today is really just around understanding like how clients actually buy. And I think, stepping outside of process or product or pricing or go-to-market strategies and instead really looking at that human aspect of the media transaction is really fascinating to me, particularly when you say around the world there's a lot of similarities. Can you talk a little bit about, maybe just broadly speaking, why really having an in-depth understanding of how clients actually make decisions? Why is this so important to a media salesperson in the current trading environment and in the next 3 to 5 years?
Well, the way that I look at that question, if you think about a careerist in media sales, in any discipline, frankly, there are those who can get good at something, but if you want to get really proficient at it, so liken it to driving, for example, you can drive for a long time. You can get pretty good at driving and pretty proficient at it. But the elite drivers, the people who are at the cutting edge of that craft, know what's going on under the bonnet. Right? They understand the engine. They can drive around a track, come back into the garage, and tell the pit crew how to tune the engine to optimize performance. And that, for me, is what's going on here with looking at the human brain during a transaction. It is the machinery that is forging the success or failure of your career in sales. So understanding how it works is probably a pretty smart thing to do.
It really is. And I think we often refer to, emotional intelligence or EQ as being a skill that we really need strong media salespeople to possess, but that's such a broad, comprehensive catch-all term for so many different things. We think of it as if it's just one skill that you develop, no different to how you're good at maybe cold calling, when actually there's a lot more to unpack there.
Media Sales Mastery.
When it comes to anticipating what a client is actually looking for in a media solution, we do often think very tactically and very literally, don't we? We have a process for how to do an uncovery. We definitely qualify against their objectives. We go and craft that solution. We come back. We do our very best to minimize any risk by making sure that our criteria and our accountability is there. And I guess looking at that, is that all there is to it, right? In this context, how much of this decision to buy from the client is going to be made based on how well we execute these technical aspects versus how much is it based on pure irrational emotion?
Well, that's a massive question, and there's a few things that you've said there that I take issue with. So first of all, is that all that's going on there? What you covered off in that little potted summary, very good one, by the way, of how we might approach a sales process, covers an enormous and incredibly complex range of interaction and trust forming and bond developing communication. So, for example, you talk about needs discovery. So that's a process of asking questions, actively listening, reflecting back what you're hearing, and ensuring you're capturing needs and situations correctly. That derives from a deep evolutionary biological need. So it's helped us throughout history to understand and communicate our situation with others and ensure that is understood in order to cooperate successfully as a species. So we have an evolutionary biology which encourages us to cooperate with those who seem to understand where we are, who we are, what our interests are. So it's a very complex set of things that are going on under the skin there. But getting back to the point of your question, which is it? I think you mentioned purely rational, or is there an emotional element? It's not as easy to separate the two as you might think, because if you think about it this way, every single decision that we make is is fueled by an emotional feeling towards the outcome of that decision, whether it is based in your conscious mind on rationality and reason, or whether you're conscious of the emotion behind it. And an example I would use would be something like going to have surgery, or decision to save for your future, for your retirement. Those would seem to be very rational decisions. Should I have the surgery now in order to fix my knee because it's giving me some pain, and it'll probably be set me back for a while. There's a risk that I might die on the operating table under the anesthesia, but the pain and the risk are worth it because a year or so down the line, I'll be pain free and I'll be able to carry on playing tennis or whatever it is. But that decision is based on your projection of a future event, which you then have a feeling towards. So there is an emotional response to the outcome of those logical processes that encourages you to take that risk, right? So what feels like a purely logical, rational decision is actually driven by emotion. The same way a saving for your future is driven by an emotional concept of how much happier you would be and how much more comfortable you would be in your retirement were you to save now. And so every decision you make, whether it's planning on behalf of a client, buying one media owner over another, is based consciously or subconsciously on the way that you feel about the outcome you decide on.
So, I mean, that's a really, really interesting summation there. And I've always been really fascinated by how much of our ancestry and certain things are kind of coded into our DNA, and they kind of manifest very differently in modern society. It sounds to me like there are still some echoes of things like that. Like, as human beings, we tend to seek out the negative a lot of the time because it keeps us safe. We tend to avoid risk.
Yeah.
We tend to post-rationalize things to ourselves based on intuition, which is a very, very powerful motivator for a lot of people. And I think I've asked a very simple question in terms of maybe oversimplifying this topic, because what I was really curious about was, at the absolute core of decision making, do we have a type of client that really tends towards rational based decisions? Do we have a type of client that can be very much, being led by emotion? Or is it actually that there's such complexity that a media salesperson really needs to go into every scenario accounting for, both of those factors needing to be balanced or navigated?
It's not a question of emotion versus reason. It's more a question of what makes the client feel more comfortable. And sometimes logic will make a client feel more comfortable than high emotion and making a compelling vision, which is full of excitement, bells and whistles. Others will be stimulated by the bells and whistles and less by the logic. So it's understanding those, but they both are about emotional response. If you actually look at people who have the part of our brain that processes this stuff is the ventromedial frontal lobe, right? If you have patients who have had a stroke and had that part of their brain damaged, and therefore can't process emotion properly, they can't make decisions. And there's a famous case of a guy in about 20 years ago who spent a week. He held a reasonably high-powered job, and he had a stroke which wasn't diagnosed at the time. He went back to work, and they found him having spent a week unable to decide whether to file his papers by alphabetically or by client.
Wow.
And he just literally had no value system on which to make that judgment. There was emotion forms the value system. If you don't have that, you can't decide if one thing works over another. And, in his case, they were both equally valid, so there was no decision that could be made. It's like a computer program going round and round and round in circles because there's no point at which a decision has a different outcome to another. So everything has an emotional base to it. The point is your client more emotionally drawn towards reason or logic or the bells and whistles and dry ice and dancing girls? I would always conclude an element of that, an element of painting a picture of the future, even if that picture of the future is a purely logical one. If you think your client and you've done your kind of analysis and reflection on what floats his boat or her boat, and you've concluded that it's very logic based, then being able to paint a picture of a very ordered, structured outcome which has a strong business case and ROI behind it, that is still appealing to emotion on their behalf.
That's the interesting area I was about to ask you about. There's a book I read many years ago called Pitch Anything, and it was basically best practice pitching, and he certainly doesn't go into the level of depth you're now going into, but he does talk around certain ways to activate different parts of people's frontal lobe, like in terms of how to set a pitch up and create that element of tension or that element of excitement at the beginning. So it's interesting. I think, to me, it sounds like you're going a couple of layers much deeper than that, and very much not looking for a couple of ways to hack someone's biochemistry, but to actually just go, how do people actually make these types of decisions? What's their tendency? What's their personality? And how do we then adapt our approach to really be optimized against that? Is that sort of, I guess, a fair summation?
We kind of do want to hack their biochemistry a little bit. I mean, here's a good example. There's an economist called Paul Zak who did a study in the early part of this century around what the single most important factor that he could identify in successful economies, prosperous economies. What do they have in common? And he studied everything. He studied, population size, access to natural resources, climate, standard of living, standard of education, and so on. The single most important and highest correlate between all of those prosperous economies was the level to which the members of that society trusted one another innately. So, and it stands to reason, right? If I trust you, if I have a higher level of trust with just random strangers in the street, I'm more likely to do business with them. There's more transaction, therefore money moves more freely through the system, therefore it becomes more prosperous. So it makes sense. That single commodity, trust, is based on the release of a neurotransmitter called oxytocin, which will be well known to several of your listeners, not just as a neurotransmitter, but also as a hormone, because it's produced also by usually by your sex organs, actually, because it has a role to play in sex. So we want to produce oxytocin. We want to do presentations, have meetings that produce oxytocin in our buyers, because that motivates them, it drives them to want to do business with us. It makes them want to collaborate and empathize with us and cooperate. And it is the juice, it's the oil in the transactional machine. So we do want to hack their biochemistry and get them to produce oxytocin when we're in the room. That's really important. And there are devices you can use to do that.
It's funny, there's a lot of media salespeople I know who, I don't think it's deliberate, but they actually just have incredibly charismatic, engaging personalities that I just, that saying where someone just lights up the room and they walk into it and they leave everyone feeling amazing.
Yeah.
That to me sort of almost sounds like what you're talking about here. It's the ability for somebody to come into a room and really sort of ignite that type of biochemical reaction in people.
That's not always the overt signals they're giving out. So that might be the what they say, and very largely will be, but it also is how they are. So there are lots of physical cues, engaging eye contact for the right amount of time. A little bit too much, as I say, oxytocin is a sex hormone, right? So if you engage eye contact a little bit too long, it's uncomfortable, and that's why it's uncomfortable, because it's doing probably more than it should. Physical contact. A lot of these people are quite gregarious, right? They hug you or they kiss you. They make physical contact. Physical contact's a big generator of neurocoupling and getting oxytocin release. They also give off signals of their own biochemistry through their pheromones. So being in the same room with people who are naturally gregarious, confident, and have high charisma makes you feel relaxed. Oxytocin is released when mammals feel it's safe to relax. So meerkats when they're grooming one another, social animals when they're lying in groups and they're lying on top of each other, that physical contact, it makes everyone feel safe. Oxytocin is released, lots of cooperation. So there are lots of biological things going on that a gregarious person who, as you say, lights up the room is doing beyond just what they say.
So is that type of dynamic around, a big group, is that rooted in just the safety thing, do you think, like the safety numbers, or is it more around there's like these biochemical incentives for us to collaborate and to be social creatures and to kind of nurture and build trust and relationships and cooperate with one another.
Yeah, it's in our evolution. If you think of how we've become a successful species, we obviously congregate in groups, and those groups could advance more progressively, more productively if they worked in cooperation. So, if I can trust you to look after my children while I go hunting, the chances are I'll be more successful than if I have to drag the kids along. If I can sleep while you watch the camp, and I can trust you to do the same, then this is going to advance the species. And then if we can trust one another and feel safe with each other, then we can work together collaboratively on mutual interests. We can fight common foe. We can bring down prey that one of us on our own could not do. So these evolutionary drivers to spot markers that mean it's safe to work with someone, and then encourage us to cooperate and collaborate and trust another person, they have helped our species become successful. So they've been reinforced by evolution.
That's actually, sorry to cut your train of thought off, but I share this trivia a lot. Have you heard, or do you have any theory as to why we apparently sleep better when it's raining?
No, I've never heard that.
So this one I thought was a really good demonstration. So the theory is the reason why we often have a more sound night's sleep when it's raining outside is because in our prehistoric ancestors, we were very prone at nighttime to being attacked by vicious animals while we were asleep. So we had no defense mechanism a lot of the time. And so the theory was that when it was raining, we could sleep better because we knew that prey wouldn't be out hunting us. And here we are all these years later, and apparently this is still something that's sort of, I guess it demonstrates the point that, you can't outrun your biology or your evolution in many ways. Yeah,
I mean, what are we, species at 20,000 or so years old or something? We're incredibly young. So to think that when we've been civilized for 4,000 years, something like that. So to think that we have adapted in our evolution beyond what kept us successful in our primordial evolution is ludicrous. We're still that same animal. We just happen to have extremely high processing brains.
Somebody, and this is where I'm trying to sort of bring this back to something that is maybe applicable or tangible for the audience to take away. to my mind, and no, please don't take that as anything other than complimentary, because it's a really interesting area to get into, and I'm just really interested to know what might be the one or two kind of key takeaways above all else, that if I'm somebody selling media in the year 2021, that I should really, really give consideration to. Is it about being, doing things to reinforce your trustworthiness? Is it about really working hard to understand somebody's potential fears and or biases? Is it about really kind of building out that level of collaboration and showing that you're a team player and you're acting outside of self-interest? Like, is there anything that you're distilling a lot of this down to say these are some of the things that absolutely in a business context in media sales have to be at the forefront of what you're doing?
Yeah, I think our world, of course, is dominated by the pandemic, whatever stage you are in terms of being released from lockdown, it's casting a long shadow over how we live our lives and how we ply our trade, and we'll continue to do so for many years to come, I think, in terms of how we work. And I think that has had a major impact on our ability to generate trust and the kind of fundamentals of influence and rapport that really have always underpinned media sales relationships. We used to get together in rooms or over lunch, and we would be able to exchange nonverbal signals that would encourage that trust between us, and develop relationships on which we then could build an economic transaction, successful economic transaction together. A lot of those avenues have been denied us, and so it's much more difficult. We do a lot of work around how people are feeling in the virtual meeting world, 71% of the people who've responded to we've done this survey 49 times now, and 71% of people who respond tell us that it is more difficult to form relationships and get to know someone well on virtual calls than it is face to face. And 86% of people admit to multitasking on virtual calls, doing things in meetings virtually that they would not do face to face. 35% of those people admit to doing that more than half the time. That's self-confessed. I more than half the time I'm doing something else while I'm having a meeting. Yeah. That bad behavior, the reason I do that in a virtual meeting rather than in ways that I would not do face to face is because I'm less motivated, I'm less driven by my biology to behave well. The rules are just not there for me. They're not impinging upon me to make sure that I behave well and cooperate and collaborate with you. So in 2021 and 2022, media salespeople have to be really selective as we come into a more hybrid world of how they use virtual meetings and how they use in-person meetings. There are hacks and ways you can use virtual meetings to generate the same outcomes, but it's more difficult, and you have to structure it in a different way. And I would really encourage media sales folk who have not met their buyer before to do so face to face the first time you meet, because it's a really important exchange of physical chemistry that will underpin your relationship from that point forward.
It's so important. I mean, I'm very much of the view that, virtual selling or these video calls, it's a forced adaptation, right? And a lot of people are very much trying to make the best of it. And there are certainly some things that logically make sense. Yes, of course, I'm saving commute time. It's maybe easier to get access to 30 minutes with that person. But to your point, it's like the social contract is missing.
Yeah.
You don't have those social norms that people have to abide by like they do in a face-to-face setting. And I really do worry that, this kind of video calling currency that we're in, it's actually very low return as an activity.
Yes, it is. And what's really tempting, so two things happen, one of which seem beneficial but can be dangerous. So first of all, we all do back-to-back meetings, right? Which in itself has an effect on us. But parking that for a second, you find that actually access to the diary, I don't know whether you found this, but clients you couldn't get to see before because they would never drag you across town for 15 minutes. Now, okay, I'll take a 15-minute meeting. I'll cram it in between the other two because you haven't really had to go out of your way to have that meeting. So you can get a little bit more access actually sometimes. But the danger is that you then jump, because it's only 15 minutes long, you jump straight into the pitch. So, I've only got 15 minutes, so I'm going to put a slide deck up and we're going to go through it. I'm going to give you my best elevator pitch, and I'm going to talk about how brilliantly we're going to transform your campaign into something which is going to generate 5, 10x return on investment. Great. But that whole process is designed for a face-to-face meeting where, again, you're exchanging non-verbal signals. When you haven't got that context, it's very dangerous to jump straight into the pitch. You have to keep the interaction far, far higher and more frequent on a video call or virtual context. So the access might be greater, but the chance of engaging and moving and progressing towards the sale is that much more difficult.
Is there something to be said for... I mean, this is one of the things that I've been working with a bit with some of the members of my team is we're very fortunate in Brisbane that we still can have face-to-face interaction. Granted, it has to often be at a cafe or in a COVID-compliant venue as opposed to a boardroom. But the reframe that I'm trying to kind of put in everyone's mind is don't think of a video call as a substitute for a face-to-face meeting. Think of it as potentially a better way of communicating where we would typically use the phone or email. So, for example, rather than going back with an email littered with 20 questions for a client uncovery, if you've got a brief, maybe they could indulge you with 10 to 15 minutes for a short, sharp video call just to unpack that brief in a way that's maybe a little bit less cumbersome on behalf of the client. But when it comes to actually building the relationship or presenting the solution, really push if you can for that face-to-face. So sort of, almost trying to hack the technology and go, how do we kind of optimize this hybrid world and get the best out of the technology and the face-to-face and create sort of a more, I would say, just a richer experience in general? Is that sort of an area you're finding people are trying to get a bit better at? Or
that's a great way of looking at it, Jamie, and a really good summary. I think the other thing to bear in mind is these. So I think your point there is partly that these technologies are not interchangeable. They have certain parts of the process in which they play a more suitable role, but they're not. You can't just substitute one for the other. And I would include the telephone in that. One of the ways of communicating that really is effective in creating transactions and encouraging people to do business together is that there's a narrative arc, is a storytelling framework. Yep. And this has long been known, and people are told to structure their presentations as stories and so on. And this is all based on scientific fact. There's a complex neuroscience behind it, but it's really, really powerful. You tend to do that more naturally on the telephone than you do in other forms of communication because of just because you have no visual stimulus. So you tend to tell a story more naturally on the telephone. And you also tend to interact with more frequency. You do get people who bend your ear for half an hour without taking breath. You do get those people. But most of us pause for breath and allow a normal exchange of views. And so mammals release oxytocin, the trust hormone, when they verbalize. So keeping it by talking is really important. And that storytelling thing does come more naturally when you haven't got visuals to rely on. So telephone, don't discount telephone.
Yeah, no, that's a fantastic insight there. And I think, it seems to be the case, particularly in a prospecting world, and when it comes to, direct selling of media, the phone just continues to be what seems to be unanimously kind of agreed is the best way to generate new business or to forge a new client relationship. At least that seems to be, the primary means of still establishing a relationship. Do you share that view? And if so, do you think that very much still comes down to the ability to engage a buyer differently with that phone call versus maybe trying to set up a Teams call or trying to connect with them via a LinkedIn DM or something like that?
Yeah, I think the form of words and as I say, the nature of dialogue is quite important in forming those relationships. And it is really important that it's dialogue. It can't be done through email. And I was, look, in my career, you go into sales departments, and if it's not noisy, if it's quiet and there's just tapping on the keyboards, that always is an alarm bell for me, because that's salespeople who are communicating primarily through email. And I understand the technology is effective. It has a role to play. It's for mass communication and to transfer materials, it's very, very good. But it cannot substitute for verbal communication because it isn't physical. You don't physically talk. And that physical action actually has a biochemical consequence that is very important in forming relationships. So that's the first point. And then your point about to telephone as opposed to video, it's just that the nature of the way the dialogue works tends to be more back and forth on the telephone. People feel a bit more broadcasty when they're on a video.
Yeah, that's a really interesting insight. We were talking before we hit record around, the video technology, being a forced adaptation and being so accelerated in terms of our adoption of it. And I sort of made the comment a bit facetiously, but I do really agree, or I do really believe actually what I was saying, that we haven't even really gotten email properly nailed. Like, the amount of unnecessary friction that's caused and the amount of miscommunication that's caused and the different interpretations and just the sheer volume of managing email. Like, I really think somebody coming into an organization and just getting them to use email correctly is a massive area that should be a focus. And yet here we are layering on some more different types of technology and some communication channels that we really haven't had the time to actually refine. It's very much been, we're just in day dot. This is how we transact.
Yeah,
you know.
it's interesting. I was taught when I was growing up with email that you only used email to confirm a telephone conversation. It dates me a bit. You only use email to confirm a telephone conversation or to send out communication to lots of people. So if you have to broadcast to lots of people at the same time, otherwise, use the telephone. And I think with video calls, it's almost the other way around. If you have to broadcast to lots of people, don't use video calls. In our kind of research, the second most motivating factor in disengaging participants in video calls is the number of people on the call. And the first, by the way, is the fact that the content isn't relevant to me. So after that, if it's relevant to me, the thing that's going to make me disengage is just having lots of people on the call.
And I can understand that. I mean, I think, if the content is really relevant to me, and I've been invited to sit through and I say sit through, even the language I'm using, but if I've been invited to view a video presentation, and it's hyper relevant to me, but there's 50 other people, I'm going to be very reluctant to unmute myself and engage in a dialogue. 2 people, 3 people on the call, I'm probably going to be a little bit more engaged in just purely in the fact that I'll be asking questions and I'll be trying to interact.
Yeah.
And it is really at odds, Dave, with I mean, a big part of the media sales market is agencies, and what I think a lot of them are seeing is a massive opportunity with video call to go, great, we don't have to have you coming in. We don't have to have this supplier coming in and seeing 7 or 8 of our teams individually face to face. They can just put an all-staff video call in. They'll give us the update and we'll be back to business. That's a big trend that's happening at the moment. So you're saying that particular type of format, doesn't seem to be particularly good for forging any sort of a relationship or rapport, but also the likelihood is that you've actually got a more disengaged audience the larger the group is.
Yeah, it's actually something called the Regelman effect, which is that the more every person you add to a task halves the engagement of everyone in the task, and you can apply that to this. It's a killer, right? If you've got groups who are spread in different offices who are not co-located, and an agency says, "Oh, I'll tell you what, you can do a national update. You haven't got to talk to Sydney, Melbourne, Brisbane individually. You can do it all on one call, or New York and LA individually. You can do it all on one call. We'll organise something around the time zones." Then that's an absolute killer, because that might be efficient, and the CFO might love you for that. But actually, the disengagement that you'll get from that is really significant. And you made the point earlier about needs discovery. 2/3 of people that we survey admit that they do not ask things online that they would have brought up in face-to-face meetings.
Yeah.
And you've made the point, right? If you've got a large group, it's, you don't always want to volunteer. You don't want to prolong the call. It's quite awkward. You might speak over each other. It's, you've got to put yourself off mute, and, maybe your dog will be barking. But, there's all these different things that are going to put you off. And that means you don't get people heard. And that means you don't get a proper and thorough needs discovery. So you don't manage to reflect back exactly what's going on and you can't, you really want to make sure that those processes are done intimately.
Even just reflecting on what the last year and a half has meant for me, not that I'm sort of out in market selling directly a lot anymore, but certainly I'm finding it very, very difficult to have the level of kind of robust dialogue that I used to be able to have quite comfortably, because I was very attuned to body language in certain scenarios, particularly in a pitch, in a negotiation, in a client discovery. And, just thinking about what you're saying there, I even think I used to use that as a technique, not as a technique in terms of it was something I was consciously doing, but if I could feel the gravity in the room shift, if I could feel somebody's body language start to close off, I would just call it out and go, seems to me that something might be a bit uncomfortable here for you, or this might be bothering you. I'd be really interested to understand what's going on, and sort of not being afraid to sit in that for a while, but just labeling a situation. Yeah,
there's, again, going back to this point about physical contact, if you've ever stood on stage and done a presentation with lights in your eyes and not being able to see the audience, but you could still feel whether they were leaning in and buying what you were selling or were a little bit resistant to that.
Yeah.
Even though you can't see them, but you can still feel them. That's your chemical interaction through the chemical release, your pheromone release. So it's and your sense of smell, your olfactory sense, plugs directly into your subconscious in a way that your other senses go through analytical centers before they go into your subconscious. So it's much more powerful. So yeah, your sense of being in a room with someone and being able to pick up on maybe a change in their, they may have more cortisone just released, they're stressing slightly because it's not quite hitting the mark with them. You'll pick that up. You'll pick up that marker.
There's a really good example of that effect that I think we've all lived through. And I mean, maybe this is just my observation, but let's say you're on a video call with multiple markets and you're all dialing in, maybe you're dialing in from your desktop, but there's a boardroom of people on that video call. So there's 7 or 8 people plus in a boardroom, and then all the other people are dialed in from their own desktop. Somebody in the boardroom cracks a joke, the boardroom erupts in laughter, and everybody else sits there and doesn't get what's so damn funny.
Absolutely.
Right? And that's happened so many times where I'm like, I don't understand why they're all laughing as much at this. It's not particularly funny to me, but again, it's such a good demonstration of there's such a different experience being in that room. It's like seeing a stand-up comedian in a small intimate club versus watching them on TV. It's not the same. There's the biochemistry, of all those people in the room laughing with you creates that kind of social contagion. And like, that's the magic of what we do. Like, I'm not saying that we're performers, but there is an element of that kind of dynamic being created in a room. And when the room's on fire and when you've got a fantastic engaged client, or a really engaged room, you're right. It's intangible. You just know it when it's happening.
I don't think you're doing yourself any justice there, Jamie. I've seen you present. It's showtime. No, I think you're absolutely spot on, and it's interesting as well. If you ever noticed, and watch out for this the next time you're on a video call where one party, as you say, is in a boardroom and there's a few of them there, there'll be moments where they all look at each other in the boardroom. They haven't said anything. They just all instantly look at each other. What is the trigger there? Something has happened between them that is, again, unspoken. It may be something physical. Maybe someone's shifted their body language. It may be someone has said something. But usually they just turn and look at each other. It's that same, it's that thing about I feel I'm being watched. It's there are those, as I say, so those non-verbal cues. It's fascinating, and if you're trying to convince, and of course we're all in the business of change, we're all trying to influence buyers to do something different than they were doing before. And if you're trying to convince a change and take a risk, you have to make someone feel safe. And that is very difficult to do if you haven't had that physical contact before.
It's a topic I think we're going to have to unpack a lot further, but I want to jump into our listener submitted question because this one's particularly relevant to yourself.
I can't ask my sales manager that.
So this one comes from, he's actually submitted a few questions. He's based in Austin, Texas. And here is the question.
Hey, Jamie, I hope this gets on your show. Look, I heard you had someone on to talk about neuroscience and the sales of client persuasion. I would love to understand more about this as I sell in a pretty competitive marketplace. We have a lot of competitors, and pretty much we're really limited on client opportunity. There's not a lot of product differentiation, and we all compete on price. So I'm wondering, is there anything that I can do outside of product, price, or process that could help give me a competitive edge?
So I did share Kinzler with this person and told him you would be on, and he sort of crafted the question around, what his challenge is. But I think he's really getting into this place of going, how outside of kind of all of the things that we all have in our kit bag, how can I differentiate my sales approach? Any sort of initial thoughts just reflecting on that? If this person came to you and engaged your services, what might be some of the things you'd sort of diagnose, could be helpful here?
One of the things that drove me into this area around Kinzler is the rise of sales theory of 10 or 12, 15 years ago, which started to discredit the idea that people buy people and relationships are important. Challenger theory is probably the most famous of these, that says everything you knew about sales is wrong. It's not about relationships. It's all about being able to educate. So I take issue with the first part of that. It is not about relationships. It is absolutely about relationships. They are absolutely the fundamental and prerequisite foundation of every successful transactional relationship. But education is also an important part of, in fact, forming that relationship. So it goes back to that point. If you're in a commoditized market and you want to stand out and you don't want to go to price, then you have to be the value. You have to be the value. And that has to be the differentiating point, is you. So goes back to this point about establishing trust and gaining the right chemical release from your buyer. It's about showing interest in their interest. It's about educating them to show that you have their interests at heart. These are, again, evolutionary triggers for us to want to trust and cooperate with someone. If they're showing that they have my interests, their interests, and we have mutually beneficial outcomes. So all the things you learn in the media sales trade, actively listening, playing back the details of what you hear when you make small talk with someone, if they're talking about their kids and where they live, and use the names of the children you hear, play back the suburb that the person lives in. Those details will again make someone feel heard, valued, and therefore relax that little bit more. Again, you get the right hormonal release, and that will make you stand out. And so again, subconsciously or not, they will start to feel as though you are more trustworthy than the other guy. And ultimately, we can all cite transactions in our lives when we are buyers that we've made because we like the guy selling to us, and where the product is essentially commoditized. Frankly, the financial services the guy was offering, I could get insurance from anyone and it'll probably give me the cover that I need. But I like this guy. It wasn't necessarily the cheapest. It's this guy. I just feel he's going to do what he says on the tin. He's got a substantiation behind him, and I can't put my finger on it, but I just warmed to him. Somebody said yesterday, actually, that they had they put their house on the market with a real estate agent who'd remained in touch with them for the previous 2 years with just little nuggets of information and education, not necessarily about real estate, but just about, hey, we met the other day. Here's something I thought you might enjoy. Little nuggets of information that he had pinned to what he'd learned about this seller. And he said, when I came to putting my house on the market, I thought, this guy, I quite like him. Let's give him the business.
It's that whole, it's a very old theory, which isn't anything new around, investments in the emotional bank account, but it's very true. And you're right, just reflecting on my own choices as a consumer, I definitely feel right about a person or a product, and then I somewhat rationalize it to myself after the fact, particularly if I'm paying a premium in price, or if it's a bit harder to get. But it's very hard to sometimes articulate what the process is, but it's like, it just doesn't feel right. That's a phrase we say. And I feel like that actually articulates a lot of the time what is happening when we are thinking of making some sort of purchase or financial transaction. Is we don't say this doesn't line up against my specific buying criteria. We go, this doesn't feel like value to me.
Yeah.
I think that's a fantastic insight for this person. And look, I feel their pain, but I agree with you. Chris Winterburn, obviously, who we both know, who runs the Media Eye survey, which is in the Australian market, a big national survey between publishers and media agencies to identify how they're working together and to effectively score who's best in class. I don't want to quote him out of context here, but he said on many occasions that, you've got media publishers that have great products, great processes, great resourcing, great client engagement budgets. They spend a lot of money on innovation, a lot of money on all these things. But the single biggest determining factor of if a publisher is going to score well or not is the person that is actually sitting in front of the client. Do they like that person? Do they connect with that person on an emotional level? Do they feel like that person has their back and they can trust that person and they want to do business? So it's a point that's probably not to be understated, is how important that actual personal connection is to making this whole system kind of function.
Absolutely. And I think it's something that will be well advised to a lot of the ad tech and martech vendors who really don't put enough weight on that and think that their product is going to do all the work for them. Don't get me wrong, product is still important. You have to have something substantial to sell, but on its own, it probably won't get the cut through.
Yeah, I'd agree. I'd even say, to add to that, not to beat up on them, but just an understanding of human psychology to inform the actual adoption of people using the tech. How many times have we got something that's supposed to have this great capability, but it's just completely counterintuitive to use? It's, again, I'm sort of rambling here a bit, but I agree with you. I think there's a healthy level of tension that's going to exist between tech and, this side of human interaction and psychology. But I do think that you're absolutely correct in that there just needs to be a little bit of a closer kind of connection between the two. Dave, thank you for your time. Really fascinating sort of area. And I do wonder if actually we're only skimming the surface of this, and we probably would benefit from a follow-up episode once we get some feedback from the audience. But I would love if you could indulge us, if there is maybe one kind of key takeaway that you might want to leave the audience with that they can apply immediately, this week, all around this topic of understanding how clients buy. What might that be?
One thing that I would leave you with is that there's an old saying that trust begets trust, and it is actually based in scientific fact. You will generate trust if you show trust. And so it's very tempting for us as salespeople who want to go in and impress to do the whole chest puffed out, big I am, blow your own horn kind of show up in front of a client. If you can actually show that you're human, you're kind, you're authentic, you're interested in the other person, do the little things on it. If you're on a video call, do a little thing like help them out, give them help solve a problem for them. Give them a Netflix recommendation, or a really good walking route. They're little tiny things, but they will mark you out as a problem solver and someone who is kind, interested, and willing to give of yourself. That has far more weight than a CV worth of, I did this and I did that and look at me, I'm enormous. It's tempting for us to do that because we're salespeople and we want to come across as being, impressive, and we want people to be dazzled by us. Don't try and dazzle, try and be kind. Phenomenal thought there to share, Dave. Thank you very much. How can people get in touch with you and learn a little bit more around what you're doing? Well, drop me a line. Visit kinzler.com.au, and there are ways to get in touch with me through that website, or drop me a line. Jamie, I'm sure you'll include my details on the notes for the podcast. I will indeed. Yep. But that time's really flown. So I've really enjoyed talking to you, Jamie. Thanks for having me on. Hey, it's been my absolute pleasure, Dave Roddick, and I'd really encourage everybody, just jump into the show notes, give Dave a follow on LinkedIn, learn more about what these guys are doing, and certainly hit us up if there's an area that you thought we could unpack a bit further, or if I was talking too much and I should have just let Dave talk more. Give us the feedback. We are here to serve you. But Dave, thanks, mate. Have a fantastic night, and I look forward to talking to you again soon. You too, Jamie. Thanks very much.
You've been listening to Media Sales Mastery, the podcast for media sales professionals. Head to MediaSalesMastery.com to help pick the topic, guide the show, and don't forget to subscribe to receive new episodes each week.